What's up, guys? John the Morgile here, checking in for a Flat Earth video for you. Hope you do enjoy it. So this video is going to be about my personal Flat Earth checklist. So when I first heard about this topic, I completely disregarded it, thought it was the stupidest thing I'd ever heard of, didn't pay it any attention, didn't give it any thought, not at all. And I must have really just quite forgotten about it almost instantly, because sometime later an acquaintance of mine was, kind of giving me a hard time about being a truther in general. Talking about 9/11 and all these other things, Boston bombing, Sandy Hook, and of course I'm a conspiracy theorist that has no idea what I'm talking about on these things, right? And sort of as a means to gauge exactly how far down the rabbit hole I had traveled, this person asked me, "So, well, you're not one of those flat Earth people, are you?" And I'm like, "A what?" He's like, "You're not like a flat earther, are you?" And I said, "Well, what is that?" And so, he told me, well, of course, it's people that believe the earth is flat. And I think my actual words were, there's not actually people out there that believe that these days, right? Like, I didn't believe that there was such a thing. Never even heard of such a thing, right? And at that point, I had even forgotten about seeing a couple of flat earth videos or two coming into my feed, although I almost had amnesia to that, right? Because I had seen those come in my feed before and never gave it any thought, as I just mentioned. And apparently I had completely forgotten about even seeing those come up in my feed, although that topic had absolutely been, in my feed before. So to me, that was a point in time when YouTube was effective and in its natural state that we all grew to love over time, right? I mean, remember when YouTube allowed you to find tons of videos about, well, any topic that you wanted to find. You just key it in the search, and you'd find good content on that topic. I mean, within reason, as long as it's something that's actually a topic of conversation, and maybe even some things you wouldn't expect to be topics of conversation, right? You'd find content on that. I remember that. I remember when you could find stuff, and then, the stuff that came into your feed automatically was pretty darn close to that, or it would be, they had some kind of algorithm to, find good stuff either directly related to that topic or maybe peripherally to that topic. But, of course, now we have that version of YouTube which hides content from us and assures that content creators do not get a fair chance to get their information out in front of, potentially millions of people if they have certain taboo things to say. And what could those taboo things be? Well, anything that YouTube deems taboo, right? So even if it is a topic that's worth investigating or worth creating content about, if the people at YouTube decide that that is taboo, then now they can just blackball you. They can put the lid on that content, so to speak, and keep it in sort of a sandbox, right? And that's where it stays. It stays in that sandbox, never makes it out to the wider playground, if you will, on this analogy. And of course, several algorithm changes, and don't forget the big YouTube purges where they were just deleting channels willy-nilly, and so-called platform upgrades, let's not forget those. And YouTube has been, as far as I'm concerned, stuck with the proverbial fork, right? They're done. It's just a matter of time, in my opinion, before something else comes and replaces it. And I'm going to bet that we're probably not that far off going to see YouTube go the way of LimeWire. And this is because now that the features which made YouTube so popular have been either deleted whole cloth or twisted into a sheeple-friendly version of its former self, right? And I know we've heard this a lot, but I do believe it's going to happen. And yeah, I know. So YouTube is by far just the juggernaut, like far and away the place where people go to get video content online. But I just don't see it surviving for much longer. I mean, that's my opinion. I could be wrong, but I would not be surprised if in 10 years people would be like, "You what? YouTube?" I don't know. Maybe it's just wishful thinking. Because when the platform starts picking up an editorial role as opposed to just a neutral platform for content creators to showcase their stuff to potentially very wide audiences, when they start picking and choosing which content they want to promote and which content they want to blackball, they are no longer what YouTube was intended to be. And in fact, YouTube has gotten away with a lot of stuff where normally they would be open to litigation, right? But now, since they were just a neutral, sort of non-biased platform, that's one thing. But when they take on that editorial role, they have an entirely different position or function altogether. So, like, for example, YouTube would not have been able to get sued for certain reasons in the past because of the fact that they didn't have a dog in any fight, so to speak. They were just allowing people equally to put up their content on their site. It doesn't matter who you are or what your content is, what your viewpoint is, they're going to give you a fair shake at the captive audience that they have on their website. But now that they're deleting channels and telling people what they can say, essentially, and editing out and picking and choosing information that they want to post, they're taking on sort of a journalistic responsibility that opens them up to litigation. So anyways, at this point, I was given the idea to look into flat Earth back when YouTube was still YouTube, just to see if it was true. Do people really believe that the Earth is flat? What a bunch of morons, I told myself. And I said to myself, if this is indeed the case, then I have a duty. As a person historically very interested in science and theoretical physics and all the sci-fi flicks and stuff like that, then it is my duty. I have a moral imperative to debunk this publicly and dissent such stupidity. That's how I approached this. And so the first thing I did in order to get a pulse on exactly what these flat Earth people believed was I watched some YouTube videos. At any rate, at this point, I was on a mission, sort of a personal mission for me, by me, with myself as the target and myself as the protagonist in the mission, where there were a lot of items to consider with the truth as the goal, right? Such items in circumnavigation, the curvature, orbital motion, gravity, so on and so on. And obviously, at the end of this checklist, there were some lingering questions at first, after about a week or so of a lot of deep thought and revisiting concepts that I hadn't really thought about for a long time. But by and large, flat Earth perfectly fit every single item on my personal checklist, being honest with myself, leaving me 100% certain that the Earth was definitely not a spinning ball. As much as this sort of shocked me and didn't jive with my entire paradigm and what I've been led to believe, if I was being honest with myself, flat Earth really did fit every single bullet point that I investigated with an honest, open mind. And this floored me. I still didn't believe it, but I was very much open to the possibility. Even though all the evidence checked out, the brainwashing that we're subjected to since we're very little in our formative years is very hard to shake. That sticks with you. And so even though, factually I knew that there was a very good case for this, there were still some doubts. But that was just a matter of time. Once you have all the evidence and you've looked at it and you understand that it's true, then you have to sort of work on deprogramming yourself, because that sort of image in our mind of a spinning ball in space is very real to our mind's eye, even though it is 100% whole cloth fabrication and indeed fantasy. So that is a difficult thing to overcome, especially when it's been sort of forced into our subconscious since we were little kids. The patterns that we form in our psyche and what we understand to be true and what we understand to be outside of the possibilities of, or outside the realm of possibility, it's hard to get past that. And so what I wanted to do in this video is just sort of go over many of the items that I had on my personal checklist that, got me through to the other side of ultimately being a flat Earth proponent. And of course, I figured I'd make one video, and that would probably be the end of my flat Earth video making. But of course, once you do one video and put, half a dozen or a dozen points in there, then you start getting the arguments back. And a lot of the arguments back I had already sort of thought about and felt the need to elaborate on them. And this sort of spiraled into, well, now going on 6 years of making flat Earth content and still getting much never-ending, a lot of times ad nauseum argument. But I think it's important, or at least interesting, to just sort of verbalize many of the items that I had on my personal checklist. And I don't think I ever necessarily wrote this down in a checklist sort of format, but there's a lot of information to sort of chew on. So I guess the first thing would be astronomy in general. Even as a lifelong globe Earth believer, I had some points of contention with the standard model of astronomy. Of course, I never would have considered in my wildest dreams, on my own volition, that the Earth was flat and stationary. It never would have come into my sort of thought processes in a million years, unless someone has sort of brought it up to me first. So I think maybe one of the biggest ones in the standard model that sort of doesn't make any sense is pertinent to astronomy is that the constellations never change relative to one another, and the stars within the constellations never move position relative to one another. So there is no celestial motion, and that statement is true for all of human history since people have been tracking the stars. The stars have never moved relative to one another. Okay, and that's a big deal, because with all of the motion that's going on in the infinite space universe theory, and yes, there are vast distances involved, but you would expect to see, especially over long periods of time, changes in the positions of the stars relative to one another, because just of all the motion that's allegedly going on in that model, right? So even as a globe Earth proponent, I never could come to terms with the fact that the constellations are constant. The stars never move. They are fixed perfectly for all of history, and that's a big problem in the globe Earth model. It really is. And I think to me, the reason that's so important is because that's something that I thought about as a problem with the globe Earth theory my whole life. I never could come to terms with that, if I'm being honest with myself, right? And so that's why that one is so important, really. Because when I considered that during my journey, when I was first looking into this, I was like, well, that actually makes a lot more sense in flat Earth, because we're not dealing with infinite space with suns and galaxies in the sky. We're dealing with something else entirely. And I think that is one of the biggest pieces of misinformation or misunderstanding why people have a hard time with flat Earth, because they try to bring infinite space theory to the table when they're considering flat Earth. So I think more than the Earth being flat is the thing that changes with your paradigm shift when you become a flat Earth believer or understanding flat Earth is the fact that infinite space no longer exists. There are not potential destinations in the sky. Okay, the sky is just, the celestial lights are just lights above us in the sky. They are not terra firma spheres that we're going to travel to one day, or potentially could. They are not places where aliens are coming from. Couldn't be, because they're just little lights in the sky above our heads, right? So that was a big one for me. And another one, almost equally so, was the lack of precession of Polaris. That's another thing that I never could come to terms with in the globe Earth hypothesis. For my whole life, I never could understand why Polaris doesn't phase out of its perfectly central position to all the other stars, perfectly directly above our polar axis for all of history. Thousands of years, Polaris has never moved. It's always been right there in the center of all the other stars in the north. And frankly, if our world is an arbitrarily spinning ball that's processing and wobbling and traveling along multiple curvilinear paths that are in conflicting angles to one another, there would definitely be some relative motion of Polaris relative to our sort of measly, arbitrarily pointing North Pole axis, especially over thousands of years. There's no way that such a star, such a single point in space, could be central and directly aligned to our axis of rotation for all of history. This is another thing that I could never really come to terms with as a globe Earth believer, just because of all of that motion, all of the angular changes over time, with the Earth going around the sun going around the galaxy, and the galaxy also moving, while Polaris is also allegedly moving in space too, and yet somehow, by some just awesome coincidence, Polaris has been perfectly fixed, aligned to our North Polar axis for all of history. That's crazy. And that's another thing that really kind of floored me. This also makes perfect sense on flat Earth, where it absolutely does not make sense on ball Earth, right? So this is, these are one of the things, well, like, wow, maybe I need to start thinking about flat Earth a little bit more, because when you start answering these sort of astronomical problems that I have been considering my whole life and never really could fit with the standard hypothesis, this started to make an impact on me. But there's other things too. The other planets. So we're told that the other planets are potential destinations, and yet when NASA goes to the moon, there's all kinds of problems with that. I mean, and also let's not forget that Mars rover that went up and apparently had cameras all over it, and yet the Discovery Channel documentary that they had about the Mars rover, right? They gave us CGI. It was 100% CGI. There was no actual real footage on that, which I remember watching that as a globe earther, right? Thinking, wow, this is awesome. There's footage from Mars. That's so cool. But then about halfway through it, I got to realize, well, wait a minute, this is all CGI though. Why is NASA CGIing it? Never in a million years would I have thought, oh, it's because they're faking the entire thing and the Earth's flat, Mars isn't a potential destination, right? That I never would have thought that. But here we are, yet another thing. Okay, well, the reason that they're faking it is because Mars is not a terra firma sphere in space that you can potentially land on. And then I got to thinking about gravity. And, gravity is still a theory. It's presented to us as the theory of gravity. Yes, there is a lot of, theoretical physics laws written around gravity, but most of that stuff is just based on assumption and theory. So gravity has never been proven. And if you're being honest with yourself as a globe Earth proponent, there's never been any physical evidence for gravity. Until, of course, LIGO in 2015. I just recently did another video on LIGO. I'll try to remember to put some cards or some end screen buttons here for stuff on LIGO. But, if gravity were not just a theory and it didn't need proof, if we didn't need proof for gravity, then why has LIGO been spending billions of dollars trying to prove gravity waves, right? So I guess the reason I'm saying that is because if you try to tell people that gravity hasn't been proven, they'll say, yes, it has. It's been proven for thousands of years. Really? Then why is LIGO out looking for proof of gravity? Gravity was a big problem for me as a globe earther. Never could rectify it in the standard model. And yet, flat Earth perfectly answers gravity. So what goes up must come down. That's definitely a thing. We all can agree on that. On the spinning ball Earth, what goes up must come down doesn't make any sense, because we're supposedly on a ball, standing on the side of that ball that's spinning. Centrifugal force dictates that things attached to the outside edge of that ball spinning at 1,000 miles an hour should go flying off of it. Hence, we need something like gravity to be invented in order to apologize for the globe Earth theory. When you realize that the Earth is a stationary plane, we're not spinning around on a ball in space, there is no longer any theoretical need for gravity. What goes up must come down works perfectly well on flat Earth. It's dictated by the laws of density and buoyancy. So higher density objects tend to fall, lower density objects or fluids tend to rise, and we don't need the theory of gravity to explain it. We do know that the Earth is a dielectric plane. It holds a static electric charge, and that static electric charge provides the bias or the tendency for high density objects to fall or find their natural place of rest or equilibrium at lower relative elevations than high density objects or fluids. So there is no need for gravity on flat Earth, and yet gravity is sort of a wild, fantastic theory that was invented in order to sort of hypothetically make ball Earth work. So there was another thing that, flat Earth is definitely looking better and better. For every item that we inspect and flat Earth actually works better than globe Earth, every time that happens, then sort of the odds of globe Earth being the truth become infinitely smaller, right? And this is just a couple things so far. And so at this point, when I'm on my little sort of personal journey into trying to debunk flat Earth, and flat Earth is just kicking the crap out of globe Earth on every single point, then, that scores a lot of points, and it becomes a little bit easier to let go of that programming that we were subjected to as little kids, and we're starting to now realize that we need to be the masters of our own thought. We don't need to believe what people told us or what was written in textbooks because experts know it. No, we need to start thinking for ourselves, and we need to let go of these sort of preconceived notions or these axioms that we're holding dear to just for the sake of, I don't know, nostalgia or whatever. I don't know. But there's no room for that in science. Science is supposed to be sort of cold, calculating, and unbiased. Just the facts, right? And anybody that claims that it is unscientific to believe the Earth is flat doesn't know what they're talking about. I mean, they really have their head up their ass. And then we start getting deeper into the theory, the theoretical stuff with gravity and dark matter. So dark matter is this other sort of ridiculously advanced example of gravity where you've just got theory on top of assumption on top of theory on top of just nonsense, theories on top of theories to apologize for the lack of sense of all of this stuff. And it comes out at the end, we've got dark matter. And so, look into dark matter, but this is another one of those things where, wow, theoretical physics sure does quite the intellectual gymnastics in order to adhere, in order to work. And the sort of the end result of that to the umpteenth degree is dark matter. So there's tons of stuff with astronomy that does not work on the ball and works perfectly on flat Earth, because there are some perceived problems with astronomy on flat Earth. There's a couple things that appear to be problems at first, but when you understand how we view the celestial lights, that they are viewed subjectively through the lens of the atmosphere, and that really light does not travel in a straight line path from the stars to our eye, but it instead refracts and is perturbed by a whole host of natural things that are between the stars and our eye, then it really does make perfect sense. I mean, there's some deep research that is necessary in order to really get a full understanding of how things work in reality. But really, flat Earth works better for everything astronomy, right? The next sort of big thing is physics. And I would say the biggest thing in physics, because again, physics is the study of bodies in motion, the lack of rotational motion. This is something that I knew and understood my whole life, that the Earth definitely is a fixed frame of reference, and that is hard to rectify. Globe Earth, when it comes, I mean, we're supposedly spinning around 1,000 miles an hour at the equator, orbiting the sun, orbiting the galaxy, flying through space along with the galaxy. All these trajectories are at different relative angles to one another, and yet we miss any motion. Never. That's hard to rectify in ball Earth. And that goes for orbital motion of the Earth, orbital motion of the sun, the motion of the galaxy, and the rotational motion of the Earth, and yet not a smidgen of acceleration has ever been measured. There's no physical evidence for geological acceleration ever in history. Never ever happened. And yet we're supposedly flying around at millions of miles an hour along curved paths, along multiple orbital trajectories at once, and never have noticed it. Nobody ever has. Not an accelerometer in the world has ever noticed it, and that's a problem. Now also, the first time I ever took an airline flight, I've told this sort of story before, but when I was about 10, I took a flight from Orlando to Dallas, and then later on back, and I thought to myself and told my aunt that I figured out that the Earth wasn't spinning when I was about 10, and that was quickly shot down, and I never thought about it again my whole life. Because of course the Earth's spinning, everybody knows that, and why would you even say such a thing? But the fact of the matter is, the flight from Orlando to Dallas is identical in duration as the flight home. That simply isn't possible if the Earth is spinning towards the east, because when you're heading west, the destination should be racing towards the nose of the plane, and the plane racing towards the destination. And yet when you're heading back east, you're racing against the destination. You're going in the same direction. And yet, somehow, the durations of these two flights are the same, which is physically not possible. Okay? And I know there's tons of people that are going to try to argue with me on this point, but it's just, there is no arguing. Objects traveling towards one another will have a higher relative speed than objects traveling away from one another, or racing against one another. And the fact that these two flights are often identical in duration proves that there is no geological rotation. There couldn't be. And I knew that when I was 10, it made perfect sense to me then, and I know it now, because the only way that that makes any sense is if the Earth is stationary, which it is. It couldn't be spinning. We know it. And then, of course, really sort of the only so-called experimental evidence that we have for geological rotation is the Foucault's pendulum, which is, those are absurd. Here's the way that you can debunk Foucault's pendulum. Here's just one way. Look into, during total solar eclipses, Foucault pendulums will stop swinging spontaneously and even precessing in the opposite direction as they started, right? So anybody that believes that they are precessing and knocking over those pins because the Earth is spinning, then all you got to do is look into the fact that during full solar eclipses, this happens. Foucault pendulums will stop. So if it was caused by Earth spin and not something to do with the ether, that would not be possible, and yet it happens. And so Foucault pendulums are thus debunked with that one point. So another sort of third overall section of these personal checklist items that I went through when I was considering this for the first time was the geometry. The curvature formula, 8 inches per mile squared, so the Earth or standing water would be the best indicator of the true level. Standing water should curve or vertically descend at 8 inches per mile squared, away from the observer, out towards the sea or whatever medium you're looking across. And the fact is, no such curvature has ever been detected, never been measured. And in fact, it's never taught to us in schools, which is interesting. That's another big interesting point, is that the flat earthers are the ones that are teaching and championing the curvature formula, right? That should set off some red flags. The fact of the matter is, I had never even considered or heard anything about how would one detect the curvature of the Earth and what exactly would we be measuring for. I did remember that when I was growing up, my dad told me that you could only see for 20 miles in any direction because of the Earth curvature. And that's what I sort of grew up thinking, right? And that was good enough for me, never gave it any other thought, right? But the fact of the matter is, if the Earth is a sphere, there should be a very specific amount of curvature per mile. And it was flat earthers who were the ones that were sort of teaching this and preaching this to the world, even back in the 1860s when Dr. Samuel Rowbotham wrote Zetetic Astronomy. That's where this sort of 8 inches per mile squared was born, and it has been checked out and confirmed by modern flat earth proponents using AutoCAD, so it works. And the fact that it's flat earthers that are teaching people the curvature formula, that is a big piece of this puzzle. Because, I mean, frankly, if it's flat earthers that know what the curvature should be and not globe earthers, well, which group of people is approaching this topic from a position of ignorance, and which group of people is approaching the topic from a position of science and geometry? And I gotta tell you, it's the flat earthers that are the ones on the position of science and geometry, not the ball earthers. So that's a problem for the ball earthers, man, I'm telling you. And it just keeps going like this. Every single thing that you can, every way that you can analyze this topic, flat earth wins, right? Now, one of the first things that I did find was, we'd all heard about Eratosthenes' experiment, where he had a well in one city, and then Syene and Alexandria, one in Egypt, one in Greece, or both in Egypt, Syene and Alexandria, whatever. But he was able to essentially triangulate on the sun, using the Pythagorean theorem in order to calculate the circumference of the Earth, and that's what we've been told since we were in school. But one of the things that I found pretty early on was there were documented college experiments that took the same data, so sort of did the same experiment as Eratosthenes, and instead of assuming the Earth to be a ball and plugging in the numbers in that sort of a formula, if you assume the Earth to be a plane with a local sun, not an infinitely distant sun, then you get the same numbers, but a completely different answer in terms of the distance of the sun and the shape of the Earth. So, but it was interesting that in order to sort of calculate the circumference of the Earth using the Eratosthenes method, you have to first assume that the Earth is a sphere. And when you have mathematics that proves an assumption, well, the mathematics is built around that assumption, and so it doesn't prove anything other than the fact that you're really good at math. Okay? Because again, if you assume the Earth to be a plane using those same numbers, then it proves the Earth to be a plane with a local sun. So wow, I just couldn't believe, like, yet another thing that works equally well or better on flat Earth, and it's the Eratosthenes experiment that was touted as globe Earth proof for thousands of years. It's in every textbook. And yet, all it is an assumption that proves that Eratosthenes was an excellent mathematician, and nothing more. Another really important point here is that the horizon rises with the eye of the observer, regardless of altitude. And that's very important, because if the Earth were a ball, you would expect the horizon to fall down away from you, and down, like vertically descend, the higher up you get. And yet, when people send up weather balloons, 100,000 foot and more, the horizon raises with the observer. So the horizon is always at eye level regardless of your altitude. That's a problem on ball Earth, not on flat Earth. Yet another win for flat Earth. And then, of course, we have this sort of subsection within my personal checklist, and that NASA is a liar, right? And so far we've got astronomy, physics, geometry, all of these sort of ways to analyze this topic, and flat Earth wins them all, hands down. Like, globe Earth doesn't even have a chance. And then we also have NASA being a liar, right? Faking missions, losing 70 boxes of film on their way back from the moon, all the problems with the Mars rover on the Discovery Channel that I mentioned already. Like, why would they send a CGI if they could send a camera to Mars? The Apollo missions and the astronauts lying about the Van Allen radiation belts. Let's not forget the fact that rocket propulsion shouldn't even work in space because it's a vacuum, and rocket propulsion relies on back pressure of the atmosphere in order to work. So there's another thing. Wow, so NASA's lying even about rocket propulsion working in space. It's so absurd, right? NASA never invents anything worthwhile while in space. All of their inventions are made by people on the ground who work for NASA, not astronauts in space. Okay, so whatever they take credit for, NASA's contribution to society could be done without the billions of dollars for faking space. And that's the point. So NASA is the original space hustler. The spacewalks are clearly done underwater. We've seen air bubbles in space. They use green screens and harnesses, chroma key technology in order to fake interior ISS shots. They use underwater tanks to fake spacewalks. And so just NASA is faking things left and right. And why would NASA fake space unless they had a real good reason to? And so yet another sort of entire category that leans towards flat Earth. And as another sort of subsection, we have the metaphysical. So, something always seemed wrong in the world that I couldn't quite put my finger on. And I'm pretty sure that this was it, that we were lied to about the very shape and nature of the ground that we walk upon. All the ancient religions encoded wisdom within their doctrines and rites that has been the ceaseless target of modern science, or scientism. And, for science to take sort of jabs at religion never really set well with me, but it did make religion seem stupid, right? Because, like, if all these ancient cultures, not just the Christian Bible, but if many ancient cultures believe the Earth to be sort of a geocentric cosmology, stationary Earth, then they were all wrong. And what else were they wrong about? If they were wrong about the Earth being stationary plane, then they must have been wrong about God too, right? That's what I thought for the majority of the time. But when you realize that they were actually right, and we were the ones that were wrong, well, then it kind of puts it into a new perspective again, doesn't it? The Earth is in fact fixed and immovable, and the ancient cultures knew that, and it was sort of inscribed into their ancient wisdom, into their holy books. And so I would say, in a sense, flat Earth does bring us closer to God, at least spiritually, right? The sky and the stars are spread out above us like a tablecloth, the firmament. That's all in the books there. And yet, such a statement seems ridiculous in the ball earth paradigm, doesn't it? Not so much in the flat earth paradigm. We were created by the Most High God, the creator of the heavens and the earth. So was the earth. We the people were created, the plants, the animals that live here. And yet, science is really an endeavor to try to debunk God and to replace God with something more scientismic. And I think that ought to speak volumes to you guys listening out there. So that kind of wraps this up. I hope you enjoyed my checklist video and what some of the processes were that brought me to the other end of this thing as a flat earth proponent, ball earth skeptic. And hopefully this will be helpful for you too. So thanks so much for watching, guys. If you'd like to become a channel supporter, you can do so through PayPal, Patreon, Cash App, Venmo, links in the description box. We could sure use your support. Thanks so much in advance for all your help. Many thanks, you guys. Cheers. God bless you. And we'll see you in the next video. All right. Bye.